I'm here today to talk to you about the unsolved stalking and murder of Dorothy Jane Scott, which is one of the most disturbing cases I've come across, but seems to get little mainstream media attention. Dorothy Jane Scott was born on April the 23rd, 1948. By 1980, at the age of 32, Dorothy was living in Stanton, California with her aunt and 4-year-old son Sean, who she doted on as a single mother. Friends describe her life to be dull as a phone book, but this was the way Dorothy liked it. She enjoyed staying at home with her son and was a devout Christian. Dorothy's brother once stated about her that she exemplified the word give. She'd just give and give, no matter what it cost her. Dorothy also enjoyed designing and creating clothing out of old curtains and material. Dorothy had a job as a secretary at Swinger's Cyc Shop and Custom John's Head Shop. She was kind-hearted, dependable and hard-working, and didn't seem to have an enemy in the world. However, Dorothy would start to receive disturbing phone calls at work. Initially, Dorothy dismissed them as nothing more than an annoyance. In the calls, the caller would declare his love and admiration for Dorothy. Though as time went on, the calls became far more threatening, with the caller at one time saying, "Okay, now you're going to come my way, and when I get you alone, I will cut you up into bits, so no one will ever find you." What made these calls seem all the more legitimate as a threat is that the caller would give specific details of Dorothy's life, her comings and goings. This man was obviously watching and following Dorothy on a daily basis. Dorothy told her mother she found the voice to be familiar, but couldn't quite place where she had heard it before. In one call, the man on the other end instructed Dorothy to go out to her car as he had something for her. On the windscreen of her car, Dorothy found a single dead rose. The stalker had been right at her work. Growing all the more concerned for her safety, Dorothy took up self-defense and even considered buying a gun. Unfortunately, these precautions came too late. A week after her first karate lesson, on Wednesday, May the 28th, 1980, Dorothy would vanish, never to be seen alive again. At 9 p.m. that day, Scott, after dropping her son off at her parents' to babysit, was at an employee meeting at work. She noticed a co-worker named Conrad Bostrom did not look well and had a red mark on his arm. With the red splotch on Conrad's arm growing larger, Dorothy and another co-worker, Pam Head, left the employee meeting to take Conrad to the emergency room at UC Irvine Medical Center. Scott then stopped by her parents' house on the way to the hospital to check on her son and changed from her black scarf to a red one. Medical personnel at the hospital determined that Bostrom had suffered a black widow spider bite and treated him. Conrad thought it odd that he had a black widow bite, as he could not think of a situation where this could have happened, nor did he notice it initially. Pam said she and Dorothy remained in the ER waiting room whilst Conrad was treated. Conrad was discharged about 11 p.m. and given a prescription. Dorothy offered to bring her car, a white 1973 Toyota station wagon, to the exit, as she did not want Conrad to walk too far in his condition. Dorothy then used the restroom briefly before heading out to the parking lot. Pam and Conrad filled his prescription and waited at the exit for Dorothy. When she did not return for several minutes, the pair went out to the ER's parking lot, wondering if Dorothy was having car trouble or forgotten where she'd parked. Suddenly, they saw Dorothy's car speeding towards them. Its headlights switched to full, blinding them so they could not see who was behind the wheel. They waved their arms to try to get Dorothy's attention, but the car sped past them and took a sharp right turn out of the parking lot, switching the headlights off and disappearing into the night. Initially, both thought Dorothy had an emergency come up with her son. However, as the hours passed, the pair grew more and more concerned after hearing nothing from Dorothy and reported her missing to the police, who were initially not overly concerned. Pam and Conrad then contacted Dorothy's parents to see if there had been any problems with her son and if Dorothy were there with them. But Dorothy's parents had not seen her since her brief visit before going to the hospital. The next day, May the 29th, at about 4:30 a.m, Scott's car was found burning in an alley about 10 miles from the hospital. Neither she nor her supposed kidnapper were anywhere to be found. The UCI police began investigating and advised the family not to speak to reporters or reveal any information publicly in case it spooked the kidnapper and caused him to harm Dorothy. A week later, the phone rang at Dorothy's parents' house and her mother Vera picked it up. The caller asked Vera, "Are you related to Dorothy Scott?" Vera replied yes, to which the caller then said, "I've got her," and hung up. The man continued to call every Wednesday after that, sometimes asking, "Is Dorothy there?" and others declaring, "I killed her." The UCI police were making no headway, and as Dorothy's father Jacob's frustration grew, he decided to contact the Santa Ana Register newspaper, telling them about the calls and Dorothy's disappearance. The day the article on Dorothy was published, a call came into the editor of the paper, Pat Riley. The caller told Riley, "I killed her. I killed Dorothy Scott. She was my love. I caught her cheating with another man. She denied having someone else, so I killed her." The caller then gave specific details of Dorothy from the night she was taken, details that had not been made public and only someone involved in her disappearance would have known. He knew she was wearing a red scarf and had taken her two co-workers to the hospital. The caller claimed Dorothy rang him from the hospital that night, though Pam, who was at the hospital with Dorothy, claims they were together the whole time, other than when Dorothy went to the restroom, and could not have made a call without Pam noticing. Dorothy's ex-husband was the first suspect, though had an airtight alibi, being at home in Missouri at the time. Living so far away from Dorothy, it would have been almost impossible for him to have observed her every move the way the killer seemed to. Dorothy did not work in contact with customers, so it would seem unlikely that the stalker was a customer, as he would have had no access to Dorothy. Local sex offenders in the area were also questioned, but no suspects arose, and there was no one known in Dorothy's life to have a grudge or any reason to harm her. The taunting phone calls to Dorothy's parents continued for years, every Wednesday, the day Dorothy was taken. The police installed a recording device which did capture the caller's voice, but the police were never able to trace the calls. The voice recording has, as far as I'm aware, never been released to the public. Apparently the caller would disguise his voice, but after so many years without leads or answers, it would seem there is nothing to lose in releasing the call to the public to see if anyone may recognise the voice. In April 1984, after 4 years of calls, usually always to Dorothy's parents' home when her mother Vera was there alone, her husband Jacob answered the phone. This seemed to scare the caller and he quickly hung up without saying a word, perhaps concerned that Jacob may recognise his voice. After this the call stopped for a time. 4 months later, on August 6, 1984, a construction worker discovered dog and human bones about 30 feet from Santa Ana Canyon Road. The bones, a pelvis, arm, 2 thighs and a skull, were partly charred, and authorities believed they had been there for 2 years as a bushfire had swept across the site in 1982. A turquoise ring and watch were also found which belonged to Dorothy. The watch had stopped at 12:30 a.m. on May the 29th, about an hour after Scott's vehicle was seen leaving the hospital, indicating that Dorothy had died that night. On August the 14th, the bones were identified as Scott's by dental records. An autopsy, however, could not determine the cause of death. A memorial service was held for Dorothy on August the 22nd, 1984. As soon as local papers published the discovery of Dorothy's remains, 2 more phone calls were received by Dorothy's parents asking, "Is Dorothy home?" in a sarcastic, taunting tone. This was the last anyone heard from the killer, and in the 35 years since, no new leads have been found. Dorothy's father Jacob died in 1994, apparently on Dorothy's birthday, and her mother Vera in 2002, neither ever knowing who killed their daughter or why. Dorothy's son is now in his 40s, older than Dorothy was when she died, and he has to live most of his life without his mother. How does a man who must have been local to observe Dorothy so much and have this level of seeming insanity, obsession and violence be able to go unnoticed? It's hard to imagine he would have been able to live a normal life without anyone close to him seeing these elements of his personality. it would seem unlikely that Dorothy was the only person he ever acted this way towards. An ex-lover at least must have seen this side of him at some point. How was he able to dedicate so much time to stalking Dorothy without anyone close to him noticing his absence? Conjures up images of the stereotypical creepy stalker with no friends, living in his mother's basement, free to obsess at all hours of the day over Dorothy. It also seems incredibly brazen that even knowing Dorothy was with two friends, the stalker still followed her and took his chance to snatch her from a potentially busy hospital parking lot. Had he somehow planned it, or did he decide spur of the moment that that was his chance to have her? The killer must have also had to return to the hospital, or at least the vicinity of the hospital, to retrieve his own car after dumping and setting alight to Dorothy's. There are theories that the stalker may even have somehow orchestrated the spider bite, though this would seem a little far-fetched, but not impossible. It is also theorised that the killer buried the dog remains by Dorothy to try to throw off anyone who discovered the bones, hoping they would think the bones were all just that of a dog and investigate no further. In August 1987, about 3.5 miles east from where Dorothy was found, Tracy Hobson's remains were discovered. Like Dorothy, her cause of death could never be determined, though police are treating her death as a homicide. There have been no formal connections made between the two cases, but it is a coincidence worth noting that they were found so close together. Tracy's murder is also still unsolved. This is one of the most haunting cases of stalking and murder I've ever heard, with a killer who seems straight out of a horror movie, an unknown voice waiting in the darkness for the right time to strike, yet the case seems to get little mainstream media attention. There are next to no documentaries on the case outside of YouTube, podcasts and a few articles, and I think Unsolved Mysteries had a segment on the case. I can't imagine how terrifying it must have been for Dorothy after all those threatening calls to then be confronted by her worst fear, the stalker there right in front of her, taking her away into the darkness. This man's obsession lived on long after Dorothy's death, calling her parents in a newspaper for years after, but what made him then stop the calls? Was he incarcerated for another crime and has just never been connected to Dorothy Scott's death? Did he get married and have a family, or even die? With almost 40 years having passed since Dorothy was killed and not a single lead or suspect, it seems ever more likely that the case will never be solved and this murderous obsessive stalker may even still be out there.
This is a case that stuck with me ever since I first heard of it a few years ago. There's just something so terrifying about this completely obsessed stalker and killer, almost like someone out of a horror movie, and yet for some reason this case doesn't seem to get that much mainstream media attention. I haven't been able to find any mainstream documentaries on the murder other than other people's YouTube videos, and I don't really understand why. I don't know if it's just because of the lack of evidence, that there isn't much to really build a documentary around, because the police don't seem to have a clue who committed this crime. They don't really seem to have any leads whatsoever. That's almost what makes it all the more terrifying. How can someone be that obsessive that even after murdering her, they then pursue the family via the phone calls for years afterwards? It's also hard to imagine that whoever committed this crime didn't go on to commit others. I can't imagine that someone who could be that insane and that obsessive could just be like that about Dorothy and then move on and have a happy life and a normal relationship with someone. There must have been other women that he obsessed over like this, maybe even women that he actually had a relationship with, or family members must have seen this in him. How can you be that seemingly insane and keep it hidden from people and not be noticed? And that's part of the strange thing about this case, that it seems as if it was someone who Dorothy must have knew in some way, shape or form, and yet didn't stick out to her or anyone else as being the stalker and the killer. Now, there is a theory that I read online, but there isn't really much evidence to support it, and as far as I'm aware, the police have never really considered this person a suspect, so I didn't want to go into too much detail about that or name any names. But it was basically the brother of a work colleague of Dorothy's, who some people think could have been a bit suspicious. Now, him being Dorothy's colleague's brother could explain how he had so much information about Dorothy's daily goings-on. If this man's sister were to mention to him, oh, today at work I did this and Dorothy and I did that, he could then relay that to Dorothy in the phone calls. Also, Dorothy's father apparently owned the shop that Dorothy worked in before someone else took it over later on in years. So it's possible that if this woman, who was Dorothy's colleague, had been working at the store at the same time that Dorothy's father ran the store or owned the store, he could have, via his employee, come into contact with her brother, and that's why the stalker, when Dorothy's father answered the phone, quickly hung up, because he was worried about Dorothy's father recognising his voice. It's worth noting though that the suspect in this online theory is now dead, so it's somewhat redundant anyway. A lot of these historic cases that get solved now really do rely on DNA evidence, and it's just a waiting game to see if any DNA from suspects of other crimes matches up with the DNA from old crime scenes. But as far as I can tell, there is no DNA from this crime scene. The police have little to no evidence to go on. So without that DNA evidence to potentially match with someone, I don't know if this case will ever be solved. I mean, it's been the best part of 40 years now, and really the police have had no leads in all of that time. Could it be that the killer was arrested on a different crime and has just never been connected to Dorothy Jane Scott? Could even be that he's dead. Perhaps he's even still out there somewhere. Thank you for taking the time to watch this video. Hopefully it won't be quite so long before my next upload, as there are quite a few cases that I want to cover. Stay safe, and I'll see you next time.